Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Otten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I'm going to ask you a couple of standard questions, okay? Have you or any member of your family ever been diagnosed schizophrenic, mentally incompetent?
My uncle thought he was St. Jerome.
I'd call that a big yes.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Otten recording from my apologetics studio at the Duke Farm out on the Old Mill Road. And I'm joined by Chad Gross, who's recording from the back room at the Boar's Nest. How's it going, Chad?
I mean, again, it's kind of noisy in here, but I was able to bribe everybody with a pint. And once again, they're being quiet and hopefully there won't be any fights in here.
All right. Anyway, welcome to the podcast, listeners. Hope you got your ears on. All right. Well, guess what, Chad? We're coming up on 2 years since the Apologetics 315 podcast reboot. It's hard to believe.
Crazy. Yes, it is. It's flown by, but it's been great.
Yeah. November 30th, 2020 is when we recorded our first reboot episode, so time's flying.
And that was I was telling my wife earlier, wasn't that a catching up with Brian Otten kind of episode?
Yep. It turned into us talking and then you asking me tons of questions and then it turned into catching up with me. So
yes.
On that note, today we're going to catch up with Chad Gross, or at least find the superhero origin story. Have you been reading what I've been reading this week, Chad?
I have. In preparation for an upcoming interview, I've been reading Counterfeit Kingdom by Doug Geivett and Holly Pivec. And wow, this was
eye-opening.
Yeah, I'm about almost halfway through the book, and I knew that the New Apostolic Reformation had some problems. And from our prior interview with Doug and Holly, I knew that there were a lot of scriptural issues there and that I had a lot of different views from them, and they have views that I would consider in error. But I had no idea how far some of their views went in certain circles. And as a result of reading the book, I actually found a debate with Holly and Doug and Michael Brown on the Elisa Childers Show podcast. And wow, was it ever eye-opening. Dr. Brown, who I generally like on a lot of topics, especially reaching out to Jewish people. And I know that I've watched a number of his debates on various topics and found them profitable. And I think he writes on cultural issues sometimes very well. But wow, this was very eye-opening to me. He was trying to argue that the New Apostolic Reformation didn't even exist, that it wasn't even a thing. It was so odd to hear somebody who I consider to be very reasonable, very informed, typically, to be almost in denial. But so far, the book is well documented. It's very troubling, but I appreciate the way that Holly and Doug approach it as trying to inform, trying to gently correct and guide toward truth, and trying to discover the principles that all Christians should be united on. And so I've so far enjoyed it. And anybody who may be listening, we have a couple podcasts now on the New Apostolic Reformation. One of them is our interview with Doug and Holly. The other being one where Brian actually gave a lot of his background and experience with what I came to learn was NAR, as it's also called. So you can check into those. But I also recommend that book, Counterfeit Kingdom by Geivett and Pivec, and also looking up the discussion on the Elisa Childers Show with Doug and Holly and Michael Brown. How about you? What do you think of the book so far?
Yeah, I really like this book. You know, whereas their first book that we talked about and read had to do more about the doctrine of apostles and prophets today within the New Apostolic Reformation movement, and how they derive that or try to get that from Scripture and how it sort of twists things. This one seems to be more about the movement and a lot of its problematic teachings. It doesn't focus just on, apostles and prophets. It's talking about, there's a lot of false premises in their thinking.
Right.
A lot of extremes when you take a certain questionable belief and then you really push it to its logical ends, you get some really crazy outcomes. Yeah, I think every pastor should have this book to keep themselves aware of the influences that can be running around within their congregation. People are influenced by the New Apostolic Reformation in ways that they don't realize through books they read, worship music, or prayer meetings they might go to, and things are taught that sound exciting and new and, revved up and full of revival. There's just a lot of danger of having zeal without wisdom. And it seems like so much of what you see going on in the book is having zeal without wisdom and things getting really off the rails. So, yeah, highly recommend this book, Counterfeit Kingdom. It'll open your eyes to the dangers of new revelation, new prophets, and new age practices in the church. And we'll talk about it next week with our interview with Doug and Holly, but looking forward to it because a lot of good info there.
The point you brought out there, too, I thought was a good one, was people should try to be informed about this movement, if anything else, for the reason that we can be influenced by it without even knowing it. So, for example, the teachings and the influences of NAR, or the New Apostolic Reformation, don't always come with the label NAR. So the teachings can creep in and people can be influenced by them, whether it be through what they're reading, what they're listening to, what they're watching, without even knowing it. And so it's good to kind of have a foundation as to what it is so that you can kind of spot the counterfeit.
Yeah. There's one chapter in there that I was glad to see called, it's chapter 7, The Passionately Wrong Bible, an overview and expose on, how did that, quote unquote, Passion Translation, how did that come about? What does this guy believe? What has he changed? Here's some compared scriptures, because it's basically sort of a way to retranslate the scripture in order to accommodate these teachings of the NIR movement, and kind of crazy.
And you know what's interesting about what you just brought up is in that discussion that I mentioned on the Childers show, the Childers podcast, Doug and Holly brought up how I think it was Brian Simmons is the guy who translated the Passion Translation.
I think he's okay when it comes to his workouts and stuff, but translating the Bible is not the way to go.
Right. He should stick with the workouts. I agree 100%. So one of the things that Doug brought up in the discussion, Doug Geivett, was how Simmons claims that Jesus appeared to him and basically helped him come up with this translation. And dude. to me, that was shocking. And Geivett brought that up to Brown, and you would think that somebody of Michael Brown's caliber would have been very troubled by that, but he did not seem the least worried about that. And my jaw was on the floor. I could not understand how Michael Brown just was not troubled by that at all. I thought that was at least one thing that all three of them could have said, yeah, that's problematic.
Here's a quote from the Apostle Brian Simmons, author of the Passion Translation. Here's the quote, okay? Jesus Christ came into my room. He breathed on me, and he commissioned me, and he spoke to me and said, I'm commissioning you to translate the Bible into the translation project that I'm giving you to do.
Whoa.
So I'm commissioning you to translate the Bible into the translation project that I'm giving you to do. That doesn't even make any sense. Oh.
Yeah, it was very strange, especially when Geivett was pointing out a few places where the translation lacked precision and was clearly translated in favor, as you mentioned a little bit prior, was clearly translated in favor of, the NAR view. And Brown just didn't seem troubled at all. And his lack of objectivity, just, it's one of those things where we all have blind spots, especially when we're personally vested in something. And so anyway, very interesting, and I'm looking forward to talking with Doug and Holly about that book, and I know that our last discussion was especially profitable, which will be in the show notes.
So, Chad, what age were you when you became a Christian?
So, I was 25 when I became a Christian.
And so were you raised in a Christian home, or did you go to church at all? What were your influences?
Yeah, I was not raised in a Christian home. I was raised in a home where we did attend church occasionally. Most often we attended church on Easter and Christmas, and that was often to keep grandma happy because that was important to her. I think there was a general belief in God and sometimes a reference to God, but there wasn't any belief in coming to know Christ and having a relationship with him or praying over meals or anything like that.
So if you think about what your personal beliefs were back then, if someone were to ask you about God or does God exist, what do you think your answer would have been?
That's a question I've thought a good bit about. I think that a few ways I would express what my beliefs about God were back then. I think one, it would have depended on the person that I was talking to. My conviction wasn't such that I would have felt the need to come down hard on the question. I think if I would have been talking to people who believed in God, I would have been fine with that. If I would have been talking to people who didn't, I would have been fine with that as well. And I probably just would have went with whatever kind of the flavor of the conversation was and didn't really have a conviction about it one way or the other. I think that when push came to shove, I did believe in something beyond myself. But if you would have asked me, oh, who is God? I think it would have been a very generic definition of, well, we're obviously here because of God, but how all that cashed out, I really don't know. There was no real thinking about God unless I would find myself in a tight situation, whether that was with a relationship or whether it was getting pulled over, for speeding, or maybe a big test that I had to do well on. I always kind of threw up a prayer as a Hail Mary pass, if you will, not in the Catholic sense, but in the football sense. I always threw up a prayer and my attitude was, well, if he's there, he'll maybe help me. And if he's not, then I'm no worse for wear. And so, but I think that when it came down to it, in the quietness of my own heart and in my own mind, I think I always had a belief of something beyond myself. I just don't know if I could have defined it.
So at what point do you think that started to change? Was it a slow ramp up to that, or was it something definitive that brought you to consider Christianity?
It was kind of accumulation of things, as it probably often is. When I was in my early 20s, I became a teacher, an elementary school teacher. I was single. I shared an apartment with a roommate, and I had enough money to do what a young single guy wanted to do. I certainly wasn't rich being a teacher, but it seemed like I was to me, if that makes sense. And I went out on dates and was in various relationships with girls, and I had a nice car, and I had all the things that most people my age would have considered to be, hey, this is what life's all about. I think what kind of snowballed things for me were I was in a relationship with a girl when I was, I don't know, 21, 22, somewhere around there, who I really did care about. And things didn't work out there. And that got me thinking more about the meaning of life. I started reading self-help books, which up until then I only read comic books. I started reading self-help books and looking for answers. And I started falling into kind of depression, anxiety. I started seeing a counselor, and I had this friend that would always, whenever I would see him at teacher professional developments, he would always invite me to church. And in my head, I always kind of labeled him church boy. And I always knew he was going to come over and invite me to church. I always knew I would say, oh, yeah, sure, I'll go sometime. And I had no intention of going. Well, he persisted. And one time when he asked me and I was feeling especially low, I thought, well, I might as well give this a whirl, right? What else do I have to lose? I'm already feeling as low as I possibly can. So I went to church, and the pastor that I heard did a few things that really struck me. Whenever I had gone to church growing up, the pastor always seemed kind of otherworldly, kind of above me, and bestowing his wisdom upon us all. And this pastor seemed like a regular gentleman who was sincerely living out what he believed. He talked about Jesus like he knew Jesus, and that shocked me and bewildered me and I found very interesting all at the same time. But then he also said something along the lines of there have been people in the past who have tried to demonstrate that Christianity's false and they've become Christians. And he encouraged people to look into the evidence. Well, that shocked me because I had always looked at religion, especially in college. If you would have asked me, I would have looked at it as kind of like ice cream flavors. You know, you prefer vanilla, the other person prefers chocolate, somebody else likes strawberry. Hey, this person, Christianity works for them. This person, Hinduism works for them. Buddhism works for them. That's how I always viewed it. One wasn't right and one wasn't wrong. It was just whatever you preferred. They were all kind of teaching the same kind of things. Now, of course, that was with no critical evaluation of what they really believed. So when this pastor mentioned evidence, I would stay after and talk to him about some of my questions. He directed me to resources. Some of the resources that he directed me to, I remember, were Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis and also Lee Strobel's work. And at this point, I think Strobel had only come out with The Case for Christ and The Case for Faith. And obviously, it wasn't so much Strobel's work that was as convincing to me, but it was some of the people that he interviewed, like J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig, and directed me to those people. So I started listening to debates, and I just got to the point after, and I don't remember the time span real well, but I know that after considering arguments and counter arguments, I know that particularly the arguments for the resurrection and the reliability of the New Testament were quite convincing to me. And I remember sitting at home at my house one night all by myself. Well, I had my dog with me, but other than that, I was by myself. And I remember it just hit me like a ton of bricks, like this really happened. Like this really happened. And so I gave my life to Christ and I started going to church, talking to people about the evidence for the New Testament and the evidence for the resurrection, because I just assumed they were as excited about it as I was. And it kind of shocked me that they were more like, I'm glad you find that interesting. And I thought, but you don't? And so, yeah, that's how I became a Christian. And I will say that when the pastor preached from the Bible, the teaching from the Bible did have a ring of truth, and it seemed to correspond with the reality that I was finding myself in. What I mean by that is how I interacted with other people, how I felt about myself, how I did want to live a good life, but I didn't find it within me the ability to do that. And all of these things combined, I can't say, like some people do, that my conversion was solely intellectual. I can't say that. But I also can't say that it was solely experiential. It was definitely a combination of both. And for me to try to say, oh, it was more intellectual than emotional or vice versa, it was a gelling of both, and how to parse that out, I don't know.
That's really interesting. I can't help but compare my own personal experience with yours and how, where apologetics plays a role. I feel like in my experience, my environment sort of made me think, this is Christianity's true. And then only later, when challenged, did apologetics come into it in a big way to verify that. And then, but in your experience, it seems like your environment sort of created your worldview of like, maybe whatever, maybe this is true, maybe that's take it or leave it. But then you came to a point where I'm finding out what objective reality is about here, and I've latched onto it. And then, as you say, it's not solely intellectual, but God has definitely used those aspects where the truth claims are right at the forefront in your commitment to Christ at the outset. Right. Whereas it was sort of like just background belief I already had for me, then only later evaluating truth claims. I think I just wanted to draw that out for maybe the people who are listening to see that when it comes to, say, apologetics or the role that plays in our lives, it can play a lot of different roles for strengthening faith, for bringing people to faith. and how it can be pre-evangelism. It's a tool for that, but it's a tool for bolstering our own faith. That leads me to sort of the next question, and that is, you gave your life to Christ, then you started going to church and talking about the evidence. Now, at the time, were you thinking, oh, this is apologetics, or were you thinking, this is just the nature of Christianity, and I'm excited about all the evidence for Christianity? I mean, how would you put that?
I don't even know at that point in time. I don't know if I knew the word apologetics. I mean, I know I had heard it and I had come across it, but I wasn't really thinking I was reading apologetics. I was just trying to look at evidence. So no, when I went to church and began sharing kind of my story and fellowshipping with other believers and going to prayer meetings and fellowship events and that lend themselves to conversations, I just thought this was Christianity. Like I thought Christians would all be aware of these evidences. I thought that they would, to me, in my mind, it just seemed you guys are going out into the world and you're telling people that there was a guy who genuinely died and he came back to life. And when everybody else they know that dies stays dead. And so to me, it just seemed like the most natural thing in the world that everybody would be aware of this so that when they shared it with other people, they'd be able to say, hey, here are some kind of historical reasons you can actually believe this. Because I remember being a little, I don't know if this is the right word, but I'm going to use it. I remember being a little indignant that I thought to myself, I remember thinking, how did I get to be, in my mid-20s almost here, and nobody ever said to me, there's actually evidence for this stuff. I remember almost being a little agitated by that or feeling frustrated. And I know it's God's time and I know all that, but the human part of me felt like, I've had Christians in the past who've told me you need to believe in Jesus or you're going to go to hell. I just wondered, would it have been different if they would have said, and there's evidence to believe what happened in the Bible. And so, no, I just thought this is what Christians did. It wasn't, at first it wasn't, I'm doing apologetics. It wasn't that. It was just, wow, this is exciting. And I want to talk to other people about it.
Fast forwarding a bit, when we met back in, say, 2007 on the internet, you were blogging at truthbomb.blogspot.com, doing Truthbomb Apologetics. And, that's been going strong for a while. How did that get started? How did Truthbomb come about? The different ministries at the churches that you've been with, and talk a bit about what your experience has been in doing apologetics.
Well, it's kind of a funny story. I first of all, I was very blessed with almost every pastor I've sat under has been very open to apologetics and even letting me share apologetics from the pulpit, apologetic oriented sermons. The way that Truthbomb started is kind of funny. I got in a habit of writing letters to the editor in our local paper, and there was this skeptic who was a philosophy professor here in the area, and his name was Alan Powell. I think since then he's passed, and he would write these letters to the editor that were anti-Christian or sometimes pro-atheism, however you wanted to, depending on the nature of the letter. And I just thought, honestly, and this isn't my reaction to all atheist writing, and you know that, and listeners know that, but I just thought they were awful. And here I was, somebody who had only been reading this stuff for a few years, and I just read them and thought, has this guy read anything on recent arguments for the existence of God or the resurrection? They were just awful. So I started writing, and it became a thing that he and I were going back and forth in the local paper, and people at church would talk to me about it, and my family would talk to me. Oh, I saw you were going back and forth with Alan Powell again. You're going back and forth with Alan again or whatever. And it became kind of a funny thing in my circle anyway. So one day I was in the pastor's office, and we were talking about my direction and what I should do with apologetics and things like that, because it was clearly a passion of mine. And he said, I think it's important what you're doing, he said, with the letters to the editor. He said, but do you really want to just be the guy who always writes letters to the editor and to the local paper? And he wasn't trying to say, stop doing that. He was just saying that's only going to reach a certain amount of people. And so he recommended starting a blog. And it was initially just supposed to be a blog for the church where they could find arguments for the existence of God and ways to defend their faith and whatnot. And he said to me in that discussion, sometimes when you keep going back and forth with him, you're kind of just feeding the fire. Jesus didn't always do that. He said sometimes Jesus just dropped a truth bomb and kept going. And I loved that idea of Jesus dropping a truth bomb. And so what started out as FCF Apologetics, which was Faith Christian Fellowship, turned into Truthbomb Apologetics. And the blog is going through so many different, like I said, it started out as solely geared toward that church I was at. Then it turned into just stuff I was doing. And now it's kind of a mixture of stuff I do, resources, our podcast. And so it's going through many different changes. And but yeah, that's kind of how it started. And it's been a great learning experience.
I'm going to ask you a question, and don't be shy. What's your biggest strength as an apologist? Like what areas, what's your areas of interest and strength?
Well, I'll start out with my, I feel like definitely a big area of interest for me would be the reliability of the New Testament and the resurrection. Those are two very big interests for me. As far as what my strengths are, and I don't know that I have a specific one, but I think I'm pretty good at navigating through conversations in a non-threatening way, and I largely attribute that to Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. And since reading that book, it's really allowed me to know when to go on the offensive, know when to ask questions to gain more information, know when to challenge the person that I'm in a conversation with, but do so in a way that is non-confrontational. Also, I would say maybe another strength is teaching the body of Christ apologetics in a way that, as some have said, puts the cookies on the bottom shelf. Because sometimes one of the challenges of apologetics that I've gotten from people ever since I've been engaged in it is, well, I've tried to read this author or I've tried to listen to this and it's just so over my head. And so I've always kind of gone with that idea of what if I take, for example, say the Kalam cosmological argument and I'm able to break it down in a way that an elementary age kid can understand it. If I'm able to do that, then everybody can kind of understand it and own it. And honestly, and this is going to sound this could sound snobby, but I don't think it is. Most people aren't sitting around reading this stuff all the time. They're not. Yeah. Most people aren't sitting around and reading about the origin of the universe, fine tuning, the moral argument. There are a lot of people who are, but I'm saying people you rub elbows every day with in the workplace. Sometimes if you can just give them a couple things to think about, as Koukl says, put a stone in their shoe, that is good enough to hopefully promote another conversation down the road. And so I think that because I am an elementary school teacher and because I'm of average intelligence for sure, that I think it's been, I've been pretty good at being able to put the cookies on the bottom shelf. And I also want to say that I give credit to Danielle for that, my wife, because the first couple of times I preached, having never preached, not trained, no idea what a sermon's supposed to be, nothing, she politely said to me a couple times, Chad, it's really great. And here's what I like that you did. She said, but unfortunately, when you use these words, most people have no idea what you're talking about. And so that was very helpful as well. And I wasn't using the words because I was super smart. It was just, I was kind of speaking the lingo. But like I said, unless you're reading it all the time, you don't know the lingo. And I didn't know the lingo and only know it now because I read and get to do this great podcast with you. So anyway, hope that kind of answers it. But yeah, I would say my strength is having thoughtful conversations. And I give, like I said, credit to Greg Koukl. And I'd also, now that I think about it, would give credit to you because you taught me a lot about that. And then also being able to take difficult concepts and put them in a way that people can understand them. Yeah,
I agree. I remember you're posting various times sermons that you've done that were apologetic oriented, and I listened to them and I thought, wow, man, that's just well done,
Thanks.
Very accessible. And basically what I get from that is not only do you need to know your subject, but you need to know your audience. and be able to
Yes.
like speak their language, sort of translate it for them. That's a great thing to learn from.
Yeah, and I would say when I started in this adventure, I'll call it, I didn't think about that. I just thought about presenting the content, presenting the content. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't think about who am I presenting the content to. And as I said, my wife was instrumental in kind of helping me think more about that.
In this whole little apologetics adventure that we both are on, there's ups and downs and challenges, whether it's content or, apologetics challenges or just personal challenges. Talk about an area that you find to be a challenge studying apologetics.
Yeah, I'm going to share two, actually, if that's okay. The first one would be consistent prayer. I go
Mm-hmm.
through periods where I'm praying, I'm writing in my prayer journal, or I'm sitting before the Lord and just praying through scriptures and things like that. And sometimes I do tend to get discouraged if I don't see answers, especially with some health issues I've had for like past 6 years. Sometimes it seems like, just honestly, God has been somewhat silent in a sense, and that doesn't make me doubt whether or not he's there or that he has reasons. But and sometimes I get discouraged and have gone through periods of where it's harder to pray, and I get out of the habit. And so I think consistent prayer is something that I have struggled with. And I think another area is being content.
Hmm.
When I first became a Christian and I got into apologetics, I had a lot of people say to me things like, I don't know, things along the lines of, wow, God's going to do amazing things with you. Just things like that. I'm in my mid 20s at this point. You're not grounded enough. At least I wasn't grounded enough to know that those were nice things to say, but I believed them. I really thought like God's going to do something amazing with me. Here I am now 46 years old, and I'm still an elementary school teacher, and I have gotten to do great things, but I'm not doing things, that a lot of people would look at as like the big apologists do. And so I think sometimes seeing what other people do and then struggling with the fact that, God, why aren't you doing more with me? Why don't I get to do this full time? And things like that. And I know that, listeners might be hearing that and that might speak to my lack of maturity, and I'm growing, of course. But yeah, those are a couple of things I struggle with. And at my most lucid times, I'm able to realize that God has me right where he wants me, and he's creating me to be the Chad Gross he wants me to be. But then at other times I struggle with being content and just think, why can't I retire and do apologetics full time and things like that.
Of one of the things you said there about consistent prayer, I think that, in the different times we've talked and also had conversations with other people who are apologists in one realm or another, it tends to be a similar sort of hang up, where if you can get focused on the intellectual side of things, you can easily neglect prayer. Now, I think that anybody can do that. It doesn't have to be intellectual. You could just be caught up in watching Netflix or something, or surfing the web and just lazy or whatever. But I think that what resonates with me is the idea of, say, the reliability of the New Testament. That's really excites me in a intellectual and spiritual way. And I can mistake that excitement about something, New Testament or Bible, and think that I'm somehow fed by that or closer to Jesus, or somehow that's no replacement for holiness or prayerfulness,
Right.
And so I think that's an easy sort of pitfall. We've talked about pitfalls many times, but
Yes.
it's definitely one to watch out for. But I guarantee there's no one listening to this who won't say, "Oh yeah, well, that's me too" at some point.
Yeah. I had a friend named Ron who was an agnostic who actually came to faith after hearing some of the arguments for the existence of God, and he also had a really powerful personal experience with God. But he used to say that to him, it makes the most sense in the world to be praying because as Christians, because Christ is our mediator, we have a direct connect to the God of the universe. And that always hit me like a ton of bricks of like, yeah, then why aren't we praying all the time? So I always thought that was a powerful kind of powerful thought, the way he put that together.
Yeah. We talked about maybe some of the struggles, but I think one of your strengths is, having a heart for the people that you interact with. It's very evident and obvious. Sometimes you'll send me messages with interactions you're having with folks, and obviously you're putting a lot of time and thought into your answers. And so talk about maybe some advice you would give to others who are having ongoing conversations with friends or coworkers or family members that are about evidence or persuading them about the truth of Christianity. Are there any tips that you'd give?
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I think one of the things that I always keep in mind is that the only reason that my eyes were open to the truth of Christianity is by the grace of God. And so I am very convinced of that. And so I really don't have the right to look down my nose at somebody because they're just, I'm not better than them. It's just, I think I have heard Lee Strobel say something along the lines of Christians aren't better than others, but they're just better off in the sense of where they stand with God. And I've always found that to be really helpful, and that the attitude that we should have when we're coming to others is that we're like a beggar who found bread and we're just offering bread to another beggar. That should be our attitude, lowly in spirit. And I think a couple things that if I could go back and talk to my younger self, even though I know that would mess up the time continuum and
this infernal time machine, why did I even create it?
Exactly. But if I could, without breaking, the time continuum or destroying the universe, I think a few things I would say is that this sounds funny, but this is how I viewed it: is humans aren't computers, and you can't just put in the right input and expect to get the right output. I was naive enough to believe when I became a Christian that if I just shared this evidence with everybody, that they would just automatically become a Christian. It was just clear as crystal. I didn't realize that there was a lot more to somebody becoming a Christian than just plugging in the right answers. And I think that we need to realize that, first of all, the Holy Spirit is the only one that saves people. I think also that the Holy Spirit can save someone whenever he pleases, but at the same time, most of the time, it takes place over a period of time. And I think one of the things I've also learned is that the goal in one of the goals in a conversation should be to have another conversation. In other words, we want these to be cordial, thoughtful discussions that people know that they can engage you on important spiritual issues and that you're going to listen to them, give them thoughtful feedback. And we're walking alongside someone and we're both trying to walk toward truth. That should be our attitude. And Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so if we are both pursuing truth, then if that's true, which I obviously believe it is, then we will both end up at Jesus. I think, again, in summary, I would say that to keep in mind that people aren't computers. You can't just put in the right input and get the desired output. I think remembering that the goal of having one conversation is to have another conversation. And I think I would add on there that, it's a cliche and I know it's said a lot, but sometimes the only Bible people are going to see is your life. And so we do want to be abiding in Christ so that fruit goes forth so that they can not only hear the truth of Christianity, but also see it.
That's good advice, Marty. All right. Well, I'm going to ask you a question about discipling our kids. And I know it's easy for me and anyone who has kids to say, well, I know I'm making a lot of mistakes and I don't always get it right.
That is true.
Don't even say that. We all, that's just a baseline starting point for all of us. So what are some areas you say, you know what? I may suck at everything else, but here's where I've had a few good wins. And let me tell you, this is one thing that works for our family, in discipling your kids. Yeah.
So since you've already given that one caveat, I will not make it, but I will say that a couple successes I think that Danielle and I have had with our girls is that pretty early on in their development, we started doing a family devotion time. And I don't want to give the false pretense that we nail family devotions every day, because we don't. One type of devotion we do is that we just open the Word and we read through a book of the Bible and we pray as we're going through it either before or after, or sometimes both, depending. Other times we'll work through a book. So, for example, right now we're going through Sean McDowell's Rebel Manifesto because it obviously addresses a lot of the issues that my 14 and 15-year-old daughters are going to wrestle with. And so that's one thing that I have found extremely helpful and encourage other people to do. The other thing that I did that was really gratifying is I had a time set aside. It was usually Saturday mornings. We've done this with a couple books where the girls and I just would sit down and we would have kind of a mini apologetics class. And this was something they wanted to do because we used J. Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity for Kids and God's Crime Scene for Kids. And he has a program set up that has a video. The book has fill in the blanks. There's worksheets you can print off on the website. And we have done 2 of those books and set aside a time for that. And so the girls have been able to learn kind of the basic arguments and kid-friendly ways of defending the New Testament and particularly the Gospels, but then also some arguments for the existence of God. And then the third thing is, and I think you're good at this, is just bringing in apologetics topics into daily conversation and into films and bringing in worldview issues into discussions. And so it just becomes part of your kind of family lingo. It's not something you have to plan for necessarily, but that those are just typical topics that you talk about. And so those are some areas I think that we certainly could improve in, but we have had some wins there.
That's good. Listener, that ends this interview. But if you keep listening, this is all free bonus content that we would have normally charged $49.95 for you to listen to. So if you keep listening, you're getting this content for free.
Wow. You are a generous man.
When I look at a podcast and I see that it's over an hour, I'm like, should I really listen to that?
I know. I'm the
Thinking
same way.
it must not be good if it was that long. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Where really
Yeah.
it probably is really great. We kept going because it was good.
Right.
Okay. So, all right, Chad. Well, sometimes we've had a lot of talks about the apologetics world and, we see what's going on with different people, and the debates they do, or the books they read, or the tweets they tweet, or, things they're doing on YouTube and whatnot. And sometimes between you and me, we have conversations about, man, that didn't come across very well. That argument kind of fell flat, or maybe that could have been done better. Armchair apologetics, right? So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, some things are evident where, I think things could be better in such and such an area. So are there areas where you wish apologists would do better, and how?
Yeah, I do. But at the same time, I want to say before I mention 2 or 3 that come to mind that doesn't mean that I haven't fallen into them at some point, and that could possibly happen again. But one thing that I see that I just am probably the one that's most frustrating is, especially on social media, the insulting that Christians do toward unbelievers and toward one another. I think that we represent Christ, and I do not want Christ to be represented as some wimp. But at the same time, if you read through the Gospels, there was a kindness in his approach, and the people that he was most aggressive toward were religious people, if you notice as you read through the Gospels. But I see believers interacting with unbelievers and getting in insults and being very unkind and very uncharitable. And as I said before, we're just beggars who found bread, and we're trying to offer bread to other people. And I think that should be reflected in our interactions. I don't see any place for that. And I think I have in the past, thankfully, by the grace of God, not too often, but I can think of 2 or 3 times where I crossed a line, and we need to be humble enough to admit that and apologize to someone if we do that. But the first of all is just no place for insults. And secondly, dividing publicly. And what I mean by that is whether it be how old the earth is, or your eschatology view, or your view, whether you're a Calvinist or an Arminian or a Molinist, I think those are fruitful debates. I think that they help us to understand our Bibles better and to make us better thinkers when we discuss them. But I just think that publicly insulting or going after somebody who has a different view than us just gives something for the skeptic to point at and say, look at you Christians. Christ said that they'll know that you're my follower by how you love one another. And that's in direct contradiction with that. And I think you and I can have passionate disagreements on some of those secondary topics, but it never needs to devolve into insults or me bashing you publicly or making a YouTube video where I insult your intellect or belittle whether or not you even believe what you claim to believe, and to go down those roads that are just unnecessary. So the third thing I would just say is I think sometimes the line between building Christ's kingdom and brand building can get blurred. And so I think we just need to make sure that our intentions in our ministry always remains, as I said, building his kingdom and making sure that that is first and foremost, rather than making sure that we're able to build our brand, because that can always be a constant temptation, especially in the era of social media, where it's easy to make us the face of the ministry instead of Jesus. And I think that's why it's so wise for people like J. Warner Wallace, who he calls his ministry Cold Case Christianity. And he has even gone on record as saying, I refuse to put my name on it because I don't want it to be about me. And I don't want it to be centered on me. Not criticizing people who do that, but I do think it's wise.
Yeah, that reminds me, our bobbleheads will be ready for our listeners to purchase at the turn of the year, just in time for Christmas.
Your Chad Gross shirt does look good, though. I will say that. Yeah. It looks really good on you.
You're going to call, yes. And it's got Chad Gross under there. All right, so we talked about maybe a few pitfalls. Personally, we've talked, that we could fall into. We talked about discipleship a bit, things that we as apologists could do better at sometimes. One area I would like you to speak to is online conversations. That's something that you mentioned during the, what could we do better? One thing that tends to get out of hand with online conversations sometimes that you end up putting a lot of time and energy into them, and sometimes they can turn negative or take quite a bit of attention. How do you not allow online conversations to get out of hand?
That's a great question. For a fact that when I first began engaging in online conversations, that I did quite let them get out of hand, and I put entirely too much time into them, almost to the point of it being somewhat of a obsession. And you, through coaching me a good bit, helped me to begin to think about things like staying on one topic instead of trying to answer 6 or 7 different threads of a conversation, to zero in on what is the main thing, what is the most important thing to address. And so I think that is helpful. I also think asking questions to assess the person's intentions is really helpful. For example, I know that Frank Turek is fond of asking the question, if I could give you evidence that Christianity was true, would you be willing to become a Christian? Now, that might not be the exact question, but questions along those lines. So you're actually assessing the intentions of the person that you're talking with. Also, being wise enough to see how the person responds if they ask a question and you provide them with evidence and it just seems like they're skipping from one topic to one topic to one topic. Do they really want answers, or are they really just interested in shooting holes in what you believe? And then finally, I think that the conversation needs to remain cordial. And if the conversation begins to devolve, if the conversation begins to become contentious or heated, I think that you are not going to do that person any good, and you are certainly going to regret engaging or continuing in that conversation in most cases. It is really difficult to reason with somebody who's behaving irrationally, and it's also very difficult to be rational when you have irrational emotions going on, such as being upset and whatnot. And then the final thing that I think I'd like to say in online conversations is that you have every right to give what time you have available to the people that you're engaging with. They have no right to your time, and you should not feel guilty if you feel like you've given them a couple answers, or even given them a resource, or said, hey, check out this book. I know that so-and-so really addresses that, or this is a great podcast or a debate that addresses this topic. And if they want to guilt you into, I've gotten things when I've done that, such as, oh, look at the Christian running away. Aren't you supposed to care about my soul and things like that? I mean, obviously I care about their soul or I wouldn't have engaged in the conversation in the first place. But at the same time, I have a wife, I have children, I have a job, I have a house to take care of. I have other pursuits that I'm involved in, and I don't owe them 100% of time and attention, especially when there's so many resources available online for people who sincerely want answers or want to investigate a topic more in depth. And so I think those are some of the things to keep in mind. But I think the most important one for me is just learning that some of the most important ones is just learning that trying to keep the conversation on one topic and not moving on to another one until we've come to some type of agreement or even just agreed to disagree. But I feel like I've been able to address it sufficiently. Also being aware that if it becomes insulting or contentious, that I'm not going to do any good in the conversation and it's not going to do the other person any good. And then also realizing that I have a boundary of what time I'm willing to give. And if I'm offering resources and thoughts, that I am not obligated to give any more time to somebody than I'm able to.
Good insights. Earlier, I mentioned how I could tell from your talks at church that you're able to sort of translate bigger topics into something that's more accessible or cookies on the bottom shelf. Maybe that comes from your gifting as a teacher. I don't know. But I wonder, do you think that there are certain things that from your experience teaching and dealing with young people on a daily basis, basically, is there any sort of things that you think actually translate over and help you to explain ideas in a better way?
I think that the main thing that I take away from teaching elementary school that is helpful is kind of the idea of having an objective in a conversation. Also having a couple ways to make my point and then summarizing my point. And then also applying that to their points. So for example, I'm trying to ascertain what's their objective. What are they trying to accomplish in the conversation? How are they trying to accomplish that? And then I trying to offer a conclusion to them to say, okay, if I understand what you're saying correctly, and that's my way of offering kind of a conclusion. And I think that kind of outline helps me present things in a way that's understandable, but it also it gives me kind of a grid to work through when I'm listening to somebody else, especially because some people speak differently. Some people are very organized and methodical in the way they talk. Other people tell a lot of stories and they're kind of all over the map. And I think both ways actually can be effective. But if regardless of the style and somebody's talking, if I'm kind of following that outline of, okay, what is their actual objective or what is their actual point? Okay, how are they actually making that point? And then kind of saying, okay, so if I understand you correctly, here's what you're saying. Here's why you think it. Is that correct? And feeding that back to them can be profitable. And then also when I'm presenting my own points, following that objective, here's kind of why I think it, and here's kind of a concluding statement can also be helpful.
Good points. If you could spend a year learning under 3 different teachers, so your apologetic senseis, who do you think you would choose? And then tell me why.
Wow. Only 3. Okay, so I think I've got it. I think there's a couple of people here that I could do honorably mentioned. Oh, okay. I'm just going to go with 3. Yeah, I'm just going to go with 3. The first person would be Kenneth Samples. I think that Kenneth, and the reason why is because some of what we've touched on in the podcast, I think he has the market cornered on a kind, fair approach. And I would want to learn more of that way. I also think his knowledge in church history would be invaluable as far as understanding the different critical thinkers and important figures in the history of the church. And I would love to learn more about that and how they connect and the impact they've had. And then also, of course, this is not going to surprise you or listeners of the podcast, but just his grasp on logic and how to apply it to his faith would be invaluable. I would also say another person I would want to learn from is William Lane Craig. And I'm sure, of course, people would assume, well, yeah, he wants to learn more about the kalam and those things. And that's certainly true. I would want to learn the arguments. But also, William Lane Craig is, to my knowledge, one of the most disciplined people that I'm aware of. I remember an unbeliever years ago followed him around for a few days and wrote an article about Craig's discipline. And I would want to learn that from Craig. I would want to learn just, spiritual disciplines, but also just how to live well and use time wisely. I think that would be extremely beneficial. But also, of course, I would love to learn more about some of the arguments that he defends. And then finally, I think Sean McDowell. And Sean McDowell, because he teaches at Biola, and I think I would get to dig into all the topics that I love to dig into. But also Sean just has such a great way of being in the world and being aware of pop culture and all of those things, but at the same time remaining true to Christ. He's in the world, but not of the world. And I know of few thinkers that are able to reach across the aisle, and he has had dialogues with atheists or people who are pro-homosexual Christian position, and all of those types of things. And he's just does so with such winsomeness and thoughtfulness, but yet I think really sound arguments. I think he's fair. And so I think those would be the three guys that come to mind. But I am going to have to tack one more on, and it'll be really fast. I would love to study under David Baggett because I love his version of the moral argument. And so and I want to learn more about that argument. And I know it and the general outline of it and things like that. But I would love to study under him and see how his argument interacts with counter arguments and things like that. So those would be the people that come to mind. There's literally two or three going through my head right now that I didn't mention. But again, they could go on forever.
Well, Chad, it's been a great conversation. We have a lot of conversations.
Yeah, this was fun.
Offline, but this was different, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. And I would just end by saying, you can be my wingman any day. Right. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have too. And if you have, send us a message, podcast@apologetics315.com. Thanks again for listening.
See you later.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Oughton and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.